space, go to the left. You see an awful word, it goes to the left. And you do this for many different times. And what we're interested in with the implicit association test is how fast you can categorize things when white people are paired with bad compared to when white people are paired with good. And we take how fast you do these things as some indication of how concepts or ideas are associated together in memory. So millions of people have taken versions of this test on our research website, Project Implicit. And here's a histogram of several 100,000 people that did this test on our website, particularly the race one. So the white bars indicate participants who showed a pro-white bias. They're faster at pairing white people with good compared to white people with bad. The black bars represent people who have a pro-black bias. They're faster at pairing black with good than black with bad. And the gray bars represent people in the middle who show no overall preference. As you can see from this distribution, the majority of our participants in our samples show a pro-white bias. And by recent counts, about 81% of white Americans in our sample do so. And so my interest, and the interest of a lot of other researchers in my area, is in figuring out how to reduce these implicit race biases so they don't lead to undesired influences on behavior. This has been a relatively hot area of research. So it's not just 400 studies that have done it, it's over 600 now, according to our meta-analysis. There's a whole bunch of people looking at this question of how do you reduce, or how do you change implicit bias? And so at this point, over 15 years, we have a pretty good idea of what types of interventions can work in isolation. But if a policymaker were to come up to me and ask me, well, what is the most effective intervention for reducing implicit bias? I wouldn't be able to give the policymaker a straight answer. We know about all these interventions, but we don't know what interventions work best, what works reliably across different situations, and what interventions just don't work outside of very specific, limited contexts. And so this issue led me to hold a research contest. So what we did, or what I did, and we, getting a little ahead of myself. Me and my advisor Brian, it was like we contacted researchers from all across social psychology, and we just asked them to submit the one intervention that they thought would best reduce implicit race bias, as measured by the IAT, to 0. And contestants could create any intervention that they wanted, but we had a couple constraints. They had to be 5 minutes or less, and they had to be deliverable over the web. And we ended up with 18 interventions that were submitted that were tested against a baseline control condition an average of 3.7 times or 4 rounds of the contest, 4 studies. And we ended up with about 17,000 participants, give or take. And so what we ended up with is a lot of different types of approaches. And there are a couple broad categories that we noticed in terms of the types of interventions that people submitted. So for example, some interventions decided to give people exposure to counter-stereotypical imagery, making them think or see images of admired white people or admired black people, or universally disliked white people. And the idea was that counter-stereotypical images could reverse the associations that people had in mind. Another strategy was to, instead of targeting the association directly, targeting people's ability to control their biases. And in these interventions, the researchers gave participants strategies to overcome their bias. And as a comparison condition, we even added one strategy for controlling bias that has little practical interest whatsoever. We told them how to fake the test. A third category is we gave participants some type of task where they reflected on their deeply held values. Values like multiculturalism, equality, egalitarianism, all that type of stuff. And the idea here is that it would make people more motivated to counter their bias and reduce their implicit association. And then finally, a fourth general category was perspective taking. And the idea here was that maybe taking the perspective of a black person, thinking about walking a mile in their shoes, could lead people to develop more empathy for black people and feel stronger ties to black people in general. These are the 4 general categories that these 18 interventions fell in. So now I'm going to show you a figure. So on the left-hand side are the 18 interventions that were tested. You don't have to read all of them, but you can if you want to. And on the x-axis is a standardized mean difference, Cohen's d effect size. So what I want you to keep in mind is that larger effect sizes means greater reduction compared to a baseline condition. So here are the effect sizes, and the white circles represent the point estimate meta-analytic effect size aggregated across the 4 rounds. Some were tested all 4 times, others were tested less than 4 times. And the bars are 95% confidence intervals. And so the first thing you might be thinking is, well, what worked? What interventions are actually effective at reducing implicit racial bias? And from that, you can just look at the 9 whose confidence intervals don't overlap with 0. These 9 interventions were effective at reducing bias compared to a baseline condition, whereas the other 9 were not. And so you might also be thinking, okay, so what are these 9 ones? How are they different from the bottom 9 ones? Well, one way to slice it is by looking at the types of interventions or the type of approaches that people used that I showed in the previous slide. And here, when you look at that, there's a clear pattern that emerges. So you'll notice that counter-stereotypical imagery and strategies to control bias tended to be the most effective, whereas strategies that involve reflecting on your deeply held values or engaging in perspective taking with a black person tend to be ineffective. Okay. One other thing that we noticed is that even within the 9 effective interventions, some were more effective and some were less effective. The most effective intervention here had an effect size that was more than double of the least effective intervention. And so we went to see, well, what distinguishes the best from the only okay? And it turns out that one thing we noticed was how emotionally vivid and self-relevant the approach was. So the one that just made it past the finish line, evaluative conditioning 1, they just flashed images of positive and negative exemplars. So it's not very vivid, it's not very self-involving, it's kind of just a conditioning paradigm. And the most effective intervention, vivid scenario, participants imagined they're walking down an alleyway late at night when suddenly an evil middle-aged white man comes to assault them, give them a strong beating, and then throws them in the trunk of the car, drives away for some indeterminate time, and then takes them out of the car again, really just lays into them, breaks some bones, crushes some pelvis. It's really gruesome. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, a dashing young black hero comes to fight off the white villain and save the day. So this sounds a little bit ridiculous, but it's tapping into a lot of the things that we noticed that were characteristic of the top interventions. It was highly emotionally vivid, it was highly self-involving, you're imagining yourself in a situation, and it's using extremely vivid counter-stereotypes, right? The white violent criminal and the black hero, reversing what we often see in the media. And so, from these 18 interventions tested here, we know a lot about what can be effective in this given context. But there's an important feature of these studies that I haven't highlighted yet, which is the fact that they were tested immediately after the intervention was delivered. And so the ultimate goal for many interventions in this context is not to see if there's change in the moment, but to see if there's change that persists over time. Whether these types of interventions are effective beyond, just the experimental session is an open question. Out of the 600 or so studies on changing implicit bias, I believe by the latest count we only found about 23 or so that actually looked at change over time. So this is just something that our area of research doesn't know a lot about. And one possibility you can imagine is that these interventions are completely ineffective beyond the moment. They're bound to the moment. Once the session is over, the participant goes home, goes back into everyday life, and the cumulative experiences embodied in memory are largely unaffected. Another more optimistic possibility is that these interventions might work like a very good persuasive argument. The interventions change your mind, and they remain changed until something else comes your way to change your mind again. So in the second phase of our research program, we tested participants not only immediately, but also just after a 24-hour delay. And that way we can see if implicit reduction bias persists, or whether it is just fleeting. And so for this round, we tested only the 9 effective interventions in phase 1, and we had a follow-up session starting from after 24 hours. Another difference that I'll mention here is that we use participants from university participant pools instead of a web environment. So here are the results that are simply replicating the initial phase. Is there an effect immediately? And we find that yes, the effects replicate, and they tend to be in the same general order, with one notable exception. It seems that lab participants, undergrad participants, are much better at faking than our web participants. I'll let you read into that as you will. But you might also be thinking, okay, all right, hold on. What about whether or not there's an effect after 24 hours? Does it persist, or does it disappear? Well, what we found was surprising. Most of them disappeared. All of the effects, except for one, declined to 0, or near 0. Wow. Okay. But there was one effect that was still persistent after 24 hours, if only weakly so, and that's implementation intentions. It was one of the few strategies that asked people to develop a plan or strategy to overcome their biases. Implementation intentions are generally helpful for helping automate behaviors that are effortful or difficult to implement habitually. And in fact, prejudice has sometimes been referred to as a bad habit. It's something that you do even when you don't intend to. It's a bad habit. And so we thought maybe we could give them implementation intentions to see if it works. We said, when you see a black person, we want you to think good. If I see a black person, think good. And that seemed to have an effect after 24 hours. But the effect was incredibly tiny. The point estimate here is cohency of 0.15. That's so small. And the large aggregate effect size in the original phase was 0.49, more than triple the size. And so this raises a question. What do these results mean for reducing bias and discrimination? Well, one pessimistic view is that implicit bias is not changeable in the long term. Research might be better directed toward targeting other levers for reducing bias, such as changing the structure of how people make decisions, or changing some of the material circumstances that might have led to these implicit bias in the first place. Another possibility is that these interventions just weren't powerful enough. They need to be scaled up and made more effective. After all, these interventions were only 5 minutes long, and 5 minutes might not be enough to change a lifetime of experiences. So some researchers have started doing work and scaling up interventions to see if that might be effective in changing implicit race bias. So, for example, Trish Devine's lab at Wisconsin-Madison has taken some of the approaches here, scaled them up, and made a 1-hour-long intervention instead of just 5 minutes to see if that would be effective. And they've had mixed success. In an initial study, they found an effect, but in a follow-up, they did not. In my own work, I'm developing repeated interventions to see if the sustained chronic experiences might be what is important for changing implicit bias. So I'd like to conclude with a couple takeaway points. Interventions that are highly self-involving, that employ vivid counter-stereotypic imagery, but that give people strategies to overcome bias, seem to be effective at reducing implicit bias in the moment. However, these changes aren't yet persistent on the scale of the interventions that we've tested. How do we make good bias reduction interventions that have long-lasting effects? I don't have an answer for you, but I might in a couple of years. And with that, I'd like to thank my many co-authors and collaborators from both phases of the project, the Implicit Social Cognition Lab, all the faculty and grad students I've talked to here over the many years here, and last but not least, I'd like to thank my advisor, Brian Lemzek, who has advised on a lot of things in my life.